Hey everyone, I'm Deet James, Hunter Engagement Coordinator for the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission.
Hey guys, I'm John Henry Harrelson. I'm a district biologist with the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission. And today we're talking turkeys. So in front of us we have an array of turkey calls that most hunters would carry with them in the turkey woods. And we're going to go over the basic differences between some of these calls right now. So you have two types of calls, air and friction calls. Air uses, of course, your mouth or air pushing over the call to make a noise. Common calls are like mouth calls, your crow calls, your locator calls, gobbler tubes, even wing bones or trumpet calls. Friction calls use friction, whether you're pushing down on something, using a boat paddle handle.
These box calls are turkey calls. These pot calls, as they're referred to, are turkey calls. So is there one called a push pin? With these pots, again, you're running the striker, but with the air calls, we're going to focus here on locators. For example, a turkey gobble itself is considered a locator, but we'll talk about cautions relative to using that. Most of the locators are calls like crow, pileated woodpecker, owl, and coyote, hawk calls, and things like that. Locator calls are used basically for getting the bird to answer, or when moving on a bird, a gobbler, and turkey calls are for actually calling in that bird.
I agree, Dee. You definitely don't want to use turkey calls or overuse turkey calls in an attempt to locate birds. I use my voice for an owl call. You can practice at home using your voice, or you can buy a owl hoot like Deet has here.
And as an example for a barred owl, which is common in the South, and I am not an expert turkey caller or locator call user, and neither do you need to be. Some can use a natural voice, John Henry will, but I give you an example of the barred owl with this call. That can get a bird, especially in the morning, to make a sound, to elicit a sound with that call, and then you figure out where he is and you can set up. Or it could be the crow call, which is typically used later in the day, not in the morning. Just a regular blast or a more aggressive sound. And sometimes that turkey is used to hearing that regular blast, but the aggressive can get him to talk.
I will just add that you want to limit your use of turkey calls when you're locating birds. I always go by the adage, I'd like to know where they are before they know where I'm at. And locator calls help you figure that out. All right, so now we're going to go over a couple different common calls that you would make in the woods using a multitude of calls that you see in front of us. So the first call would be the yelp, and this is probably the most common call that you hear in the woods. It's one of the most common calls that turkeys make, and it's a call you hear people use to get birds to come close. And a yelp is just I think it's a simple note that you usually string a couple together, and I'm going to be using the diaphragm call because that's usually what I'm most comfortable with. And it would sound something like this. Deet, what about you? What do you like to use?
Well, I like to use them all, and we will be talking about diaphragm use because obviously it's one of the harder calls to get used to. So I'll try it here with a slate call, and typically my go-to happens to be this glass. I've been carrying it around forever, but as you can see, there's a multitude of surfaces. And obviously, if you're a retail therapist and like to buy things, then you'll probably have more turkey calls. You don't need a lot of turkey calls, but we'll talk about a variety of sounds, meaning that someday a turkey may like the sound of this, but then other days that turkey may not. So a variety of calls is a good thing, but you don't have to. So for example, yelp. And basically there are several ways to hold a pot. I've seen people hold it like the crab claw. And there's also the Eastern North Carolina stilts that they put on the house in the flood zones. You're basically putting that palm against that call. Don't touch the calling surface. Make sure the surface is scratched up with a piece of emery cloth as well as the striker, and little half circles. That is a pot call yelp.
Another common call, which is very simple to use, is a push button call. And this is actually a call I carry for my kids. This is the call they can use, and it's just simply pushing the plunger here, and inside you're creating friction. So another friction call. So very simple, but again, you're moving your hand just like you're moving your hand on the pot call, and movement is an enemy when you're turkey hunting. So keep that in mind. These calls that you're moving your hands on, there are limitations of using those calls when birds get in close. So up next, what do you think? The cluck. So a cluck is mixed in, another common call that turkey hunters often use and turkeys often make. And you oftentimes, at least I do, I mix it in with my yelps when I start. So usually my first call is a cluck. So it sounds something, at least for me, like this. So I will throw 2 or 3 clucks in and then add in a couple yelps. And that's a really common call sequence that you often see or often hear in the woods from turkeys calling back and forth to each other.
I can try the box here, and I will say that I think maybe we missed the box yelp. With a box, you're basically holding the side. If it has the extra edge on the bottom, keep your call hands away from the center of the call, because that is the tone box. You're just taking this paddle that you keep well chalked, and I will say, don't use school chalk or street chalk. It needs to be turkey chalk. Those other chalks have oil, so that's very important. Most calls come with a little bit of turkey call chalk. So the yelp, and you don't take the call off the call, you don't take the paddle off the calling surface of the box. Simple yelp. With a cluck, as we were talking about, and you can either make it louder if the bird's a little further away, but we don't want to confuse that with the putt. We'll talk about the putt later. How to very easily make it with that.
And you can tell we're not winning any calling contests.
No.
But if you ever spend any time in the woods, you will hear turkeys make a wide variety of calls. And even some of the most, I'll tell you, the worst calling I've ever heard has actually been from live hens. So don't think that just because you don't get it right away that you're not going to be able to call in a turkey. I would encourage you to spend some time in your vehicle. That's what I do, away from my wife and kids, to be able to make these calls, because it does get a little annoying when you're trying to learn how to do this. Yes. The last common call we'll cover is the purr. And a purr is a content call that birds often make when they're in close proximity to each other, when they're feeding, or just when they're meandering through the woods. And for me, it's actually easier to do it on a pot call. I think it's one of the easier calls to do on the pot call, and you're just pushing down your peg and pulling across, which would sound something like this. And the same thing with the push button yelper, you're just slowly. And if you mix that in with a little leaf scratching and a little other content calls, it can really bring birds in and close those final few yards you need when a bird's out of sight or just hanging up right out of distance.
Yeah, there's one we can add with that too, because there's a difference between that soft, subtle purr, as John Henry pointed it out, that can bring them in the last minute. But there's also that aggressive purr that gobblers will do when they're fighting. And it can be a situation where if you have a bird, he's hung up, not coming in, or even has hens with them, that sometimes happen, and we'll be talking about that a lot in our webinar, is an aggressive purr rather than that soft, subtle. And sometimes you got to find a sweet spot on your call. Rather than that, it's like this. Very, very loud, shrill. That is a fighting purr, and oftentimes that can anger that adult gobbler, that dominant gobbler, into coming, and you're not even using a hen call. We also had a tree yelp. Let's start explaining what that is. What's the tree yelp, and why would we use it?
A tree yelp is one of the first calls you hear in the morning. Usually it's the first call a hen lets out, and she's just letting other hens know in her family group or in her group she's with that, hey, we made it through the night, and usually alerts the gobbler's first gobble in the morning. And it sounds something like a normal yelp, but just really sleepy and really quiet. So I like to make it something like this. Just very quiet, very subdued. I don't want to be loud and aggressive because I've been asleep all night and I'm imitating a real hen just waking up on the roost, and I want to sound like her. And I'll tell you another tactic Deke, we hadn't talked about is using some of these calls in combination, using a mouth call while you're using a pot call or while you're using a slate call to give the sound that there are multiple turkeys in the woods or you're using multiple turkeys around you.
Now, as an example, and if you're sounding like two hens are better than one to that gobbler. To get them fired up. With that tree call, again, something we'll be talking about. I keep bringing up the webinar, but a lot of this will be covered in strategies. When you talk to that bird with that tree call, if that bird answers you immediately or cuts you off, that bird's ready. And in most cases, you can just put the calls down and let that bird find you. Would you agree, John Henry?
I agree, but I'll tell you, it's awful hard to put those calls down sometimes.
It is hard to put them down because, and I call too much too loud. But sometimes we can actually make that bird hang up and not come in, because what is the natural way of the wild turkey, Henry?
The natural way is for a gobbler to strut in one spot and for the hens to all come to him.
That's right.
And so we're trying to change that and make the hens stationary and the gobbler come to us.
Yes.
So it's a cat and mouse game.
Yes. Overcalling can definitely affect that. Here's another call, the gobble. And we didn't mention the putt, so we'll need to mention that too. The gobble of the wild turkey will challenge dominance just like the fighting purr or even a gobbler call, and I want to mention that one too, almost forgot about it. Or no, that's an advanced tactic, we'll talk about that. Anyway, the gobble call. This is something you need to use very sparingly on public land, not often suggested, because if you're hunting with other hunters or even on private land, soon as a turkey hunter hears a gobble, that person wants to get as close as possible without scaring that bird and then set up and call it. So when you shake a gobble call like this, you're both challenging that bird, but you could attract other hunters. So use it sparingly. But again, the idea is that bird's hung up, maybe he's with his hens, hen calls aren't working. Sometimes this can bring them in, but again, use it with caution. Okay, folks, now we're going to talk about the mouth diaphragm. The mouth diaphragm is obviously one of the harder to use, but what's great about it is it's hands-free, a variety of sounds and tones and cadence, easier to carry, much lighter, and one of the things that's most important is proper fit. For example, this one is really a standard size, and you can see it's kind of worn. I've had it for quite a while. But they come in all different sizes and colors. And one of the things we want to note right off the bat is your palate may be different than someone else's. Some people have a narrow palate up there in the roof of the mouth. Some is wider. As a general rule, I like a standard call, which is like this. But some of these more narrow calls also work better. They'll have a variety of reeds, which is the latex in the middle. They'll have different cuts, and they'll make different sounds. But the initial way to get a sound out of it, before we make any calls, is the first thing you want to do with the call. It'll typically have a tab or a point on the bottom of the call. And that's an aluminum frame. It's like a latex tape on the outside, almost like a hospital tape. And then narrow reeds that are crimped in between an aluminum frame. And it typically comes when you buy the call, the instructions are in there. You want the tab down. When you put it in your mouth, it goes up in the roof of your mouth, and your tongue goes up against it underneath, like that. And typically your tongue is just right out in front of that reed. What you're doing is you're not blowing air, even though it's an air call, you're huffing air from your diaphragm, huffing it out. And by making them sounds, it causes those reeds to vibrate. Now what you'll discover is that early in the season, when you get started again, it'll tickle your tongue and you'll go like that. And you just scrape your tongue with your teeth, and that's kind of my routine. But that goes away after you start calling. But the first thing you want to do is make a high note and then a low note. You make a high note by a lot of tongue pressure. You make a low note by less tongue pressure. And then what you do is put them together. So you find the proper place, not way back in your throat, right in the front, not far behind your teeth. Put it in there. And when you first put it in, walk around with it. Get used to it. Because the first thing that will happen in your mouth is you'll start to salivate. That's the natural food start to prepare it for digestion. And if you start making calls right away, you'll probably start spitting and everything else. Well, if you're in the woods, that's not really a good thing. If you're competition calling, that's even worse. But the idea is get used to it in your mouth. You'll stop salivating after a while. Then once you do, put it up in there. High note. Then the low note, a little bit less tongue pressure. And then you put them all together. And typically, when you see someone turkey calling, they'll be doing this, they'll be doing this, they'll be doing that. Not only does it hide up the silly face you make with the call, but it also can let the turkey know that, hey, if he's not so interested, I'm going away. You can muffle the sound. He starts circling you over this way. Throw the call this way. Starts circling you over that way. Throw the call that way. That way you're controlling, essentially, the sound. So for me, with this call, put it in there. Now you'll notice that is what is typically my go-to. But I will say that the thicker the reeds, the harder it is to force air. So if you're a new hunter, start out with a very thin reed, 2-reed call or a 3-reed call, and then just try a variety. See what works best.
I would encourage you to buy a variety pack. Get a 3 or 4 pack off the internet from a reputable call company and see which one you like best and try out making different calls with them. And Dixie Deer class is coming up. That's another great place to go around and buy a variety of calls from a variety of people and see what sounds they're making and see what sounds best to you. I carry 3 or 4 mouth calls with me when I go hunting, and each one makes a slightly different sound. And oftentimes I'll even carry 2 in my mouth at one time, one on each side of the cheek, and switch them back and forth when I'm calling and when I'm trying to close that final distance with those birds.
And do keep it in the side of your mouth when you're climbing ridges. I tend to hunt in the mountains rather than on flat land. You start breathing a little bit. You don't want that right into place unless you're working a bird, because you don't want to swallow it and end up with that situation. So yeah, just be careful.
There are some significant pros and cons to having the mouth call in.
Yes.
A big pro, you're not using your hands. So when you're sitting or kneeling against the tree or in your gobbler chair and you have your gun on your shoulder waiting for that bird to come in, you don't have to take your hands off and work a pot call or work a gobbler tube or even a wing bone. You can go no hands.
Never store them on the dash in a car, because that will immediately glue them together. So caring for these is great. The only downside is I'd say I get maybe 2 seasons out of a call, and then it starts the tape wears off. So you've got to replace them, unlike the pot call or the box call or some of the other calls. But yes, hands-free, variety of calls, and obviously, as we showed earlier, using 2 calls at one time makes it much easier.
Yeah. Deet's a little more extreme than I am on caring for his calls. This call I have in my mouth, I took it out of my bag this morning and I haven't touched it since last hunting season when I put it in my bag, and it ran just fine on the way here. So there's some wins and losses.
You'll find your own style. That's what you go with. Okay, folks, we're going to get into our last segment here, and that's going to be advanced calling techniques. We also, in our webinars, hopefully, yes, you're watching that right now, perhaps, we'll be talking about advanced tactics, but this is advanced calling. So we're going to share 3. I'm going to start out with cutting. I'll start with a diaphragm. I do like to cut with a diaphragm, but I'll probably pick up a box and a slate as well, just real quick to give you examples. Cutting with a diaphragm, it's real fast, not yelps, but clucks. and it's an excited hen. She's excited in coming into the gobbler, and by and large, other than the start out with the yelp or maybe a purr or a tree call, I like the cut. So if I find that that bird is fired up and he's gobbling, I will call too much, too loud. But remember too, once that bird gets to a position where you can see him and he can see you, do not make any calls, because then immediately that bird will pick you out, and since you will not be a turkey, he'll be gone. Cutting. Usually I'll start out with maybe a cluck, couple yelps, and then I'll go into a cut. And you don't have to make, it's okay to come back to a purr, it's okay to come back to a cluck, and even if you end on a sour note, like, just cover it up, keep going. That's an example. Because if you stop, that can be a bad thing. Say on a box call, cutting. On a slate. And again, remember, sounding like two birds, diaphragm, and a pot or a box. That is cutting.
So up next would be the fly down cackle, and the fly down cackle is a sequence of sounds that a hen will often make when she's flying down from the roost in the morning. And it's a sequence that I use when a gobbler's already gobbled a couple times on the roost, and I want him to think, hey, come on over here to the hen that's over here, not the hens that are over there. So I usually started off with a few light hen yelps, kind of like Deep did, and then progress into getting louder. And you can add different things into it. Some people have wings with them to simulate the fly down. Some people take their hat off and beat it against their leg. People do a wide variety of things to add sounds to this call. But for me, I try to keep it simple, and I use something like this. And I tend to start high and then kind of coast off like she's flying down out of the tree, getting ready to hit the ground. And usually as she's hitting the ground, she turns off that cackle and starts yelping afterwards. Deep, you do anything different?
Same thing, usually use my hat, or sometimes a wing. A turkey wing works nice if you save that from a previous gobbler. But yeah, basically the same thing.
Okay. The next call that we cover would be gobbles. So Dee kind of talked about the gobbler shaker earlier. I tend to gobble with my diaphragm. I shake my head, it gets a different sound. But again, you usually sparingly. I don't typically use it on public land, but oftentimes my favorite time to use it is when I know there's multiple gobblers together that are grouped up. I've either seen them in the field somewhere, or I've heard them gobbling together, and then I want to imitate a lone gobbler, maybe even with a hen, and they try to encourage one of them to come over and investigate and be dominant over top of me. So for me, a gobble sounds something like this. And Dee's just demonstrated on the gobble tube, and there's a couple different ways you can work that.
Yep, this can either be used this way, by hand, by using the plunger by hand, or just shaking it. But again, be careful using the gobble call, because you could attract another hunter, and many won't even use it if they're hunting public land, unless they're in a really isolated area.
Yep. So just like you can hear that gobble, and you want that gobbler to hear that gobble, so can other hunters in the area.
The spit and drum is probably not used by a lot of hunters. There are calls that are made to spit and drum, but although I bought them, I have yet to make them work. It's just, you've got to like say things like chukka, 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 and my mouth just don't want to do it. That's why I don't purr well with a diaphragm. And in fact, when we were young and you know, people could flutter their tongue. I can't do that, and that makes good purrs. But for the spit and drum, That is a call that a gobbler makes when he goes from just being, that all his feathers are down, he'll go into that strut. He's getting ready to display for that hen, and he'll basically puff up and he'll go. And if that bird's close, you'll hear that. And if that bird's close, don't move. If you hear that sound, that means he's close. So again, he'll go from that just walking, he'll all of a sudden bring that, you'll start seeing the wings and the tail going up. And if you can do that with your face mask on so you're not moving your mouth, you just never know.
That's one of my favorite sounds in the woods to hear, because that means that bird's close, and usually if I haven't seen him already, I'm gonna see him very shortly.
And then you're doing this. So be careful, don't move.
I'm usually doing this,
Yes.
clicking the safety off. So up next would be the kiki. The kiki is like a whistling type call that you often hear hens making in the fall when they're together or when a large group of hens are together. And to me, it's one of those kind of locator calls or keep in touch calls that they tend to make to let each other know where they are as they're feeding throughout the day. Let's hear the kiki.
Yep, and this can be a bird that's, say, maybe a non-dominant gobbler, because there's a dominant gobbler and then there's lesser gobblers, often referred to as satellites or subordinates. He may be looking for a buddy. Maybe his buddy was harvested or he's by himself. That fall call was a, hey, I'm over here, you know, let's get together kind of thing. Is it commonly used in the spring? No, but it can be the difference when a turkey's not responding to a yelp or a gobble. Not my business. Whistle followed by yelps. Again, it's just another trick in the bag of tricks. Okay, gobbler yelping. Something from my many years of the fine collection of now obsolete VHS videos and DVDs. One hunter from Missouri used to often use gobble yelping. Why use gobble yelping? You want to sound like a hen in the spring. It's the mating season. But that is another thing that challenges the dominance of another male. And especially if the area that you're hunting in, for example, I typically start in a northern state, in the mountains where it's much colder, and although the photo period is what brings turkeys into breeding, you could be having a late spring. When you have a late spring, again, even though the amount of sunlight is what brings them in to breeding, they can get in almost like a fall mood. And gobblers will gobble yelp. And using a gobble yelp can challenge that dominance or even say, hey, I'm another, you know, I'm looking for a buddy. Because gobblers hang together in the fall and late winter. So the difference is, and I'll use this, the slate, it's probably the easiest to do, is a regular hen yelp is a faster cadence. Regular hen yelp. Gobbler yelp is more like this. Slow it down, not fast. And they'll even cluck sometimes in that. That's a gobbler yelp.
I tend to hear the gobbler yelp when it's a group of jakes together that can't quite gobble or haven't developed their gobble all the way, and they tend to yelp back and forth to other gobblers that are gobbling or even to hens that are calling. That's when I tend to hear that gobble yelp most often.
Yep. Okay folks, the last call we're going to use is not a call that you would use in turkey hunting. It is an alarm call that the turkeys use. And in fact, if you hear this sound, it means if you don't have a shot at that bird, if that bird is out of range, if that bird is not seen, you can pretty much guarantee you won't get a shot, and it is called the putt. And we just want you to know what it is so you can recognize it. And we don't use a box call or a slate call or a diaphragm. You probably could use a diaphragm, but I can just usually make the call with my loud, annoying voice. And it basically goes like this. And if you hear that sound, that is the worst sound. It is so disheartening because it means that turkey saw something it didn't like, and before you know it, him and the others are doing it, and they're going the other way.
Well, yeah, I'll tell you, last season I had a hen doing that alarm call, and I started calling over top of her. She was separate from the gobblers. She of course ran off. Those gobblers kept coming on in. So that doesn't always mean doesn't always mean the bird you're chasing is the one that saw you, but you definitely don't want to hear that sound in the woods. That's not one we're going for.
Absolutely, good point.
So I guess the final few things to wrap up here. You don't have to be perfect to call a turkey in. You don't have to be an expert to call a turkey in. You can do it with a few simple calls. You can get at Walmart, you can get at Amazon, or you can go extravagant and buy handmade custom calls. But I encourage you to practice your calls before season, but don't practice them in the woods. You're educating birds for later on in the season when you don't need that education.
Yes, and I will say with the mouth diaphragm, the first time I picked it up, I was like, I'm never going to get this. And once you do that, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And you don't want to do it around family members because it will drive them nuts. So a good way to do it at that time when I first started doing it, was probably in the late 80s, is I would go out. There was a park near where I lived, and at night after work I'd go for walks and I'd keep trying it. Well, finally, when I got them sounds, and if you do practice it in a way, like I said, the high note, low note, you will eventually pick it up. It may take some time, but even if you don't, the box, the slate, the push-pull, those calls work. And again, getting to the point of calling, you're going to love to call, you're going to call too much. Use calling sparingly. Again, if you're convinced that bird sounds like he's coming closer and he's responding, let him find you. You don't need to keep calling, because keep in mind that every time you do call, that bird's typically, even if you can't see him, he'll go into that strut, he'll do the spit and drum. He's expecting that hen to show up. So let him seek you out.
Patience has killed more turkeys than calling ever has.
Exactly.
A little tip.
Exactly. Good luck this season. Be ethical, be safe, and pass it on.
It's a good ending, Deep.